A single, isolated encounter carries a remarkably low chance of transmission. Unprotected, the female-to-male transmission rate for genital herpes is estimated at less than 1% per single act. Yet population data tells a completely different story. A comprehensive serosurvey conducted at this urban emergency department in Baltimore City found that 54.4% of the adult patients tested positive for herpes simplex virus type 2. Clients often manage this threat through visual inspections and latex barriers. There is a persistent belief that if a partner has no visible sores and a condom is used, the risk effectively drops to zero. To understand the actual hazard, we need to map the medical data to the real-world behavior of a hobbyist. We are going to calculate the multi-year probability of contracting the virus when seeing a provider roughly 1 to 2 times a week. A long-term hobby consists of hundreds of individual encounters. Evaluating safety requires looking past the single-act probability and calculating the cumulative risk over time. We will run this risk analysis using specific variables from the Johns Hopkins study, comparing the mathematical exposure of sourcing providers in the inner city versus the surrounding suburbs across different age brackets. Relying on a fractional daily transmission rate is a mathematical trap. When the local prevalence is high enough, a tiny daily probability repeatedly subjected to exposure compounds into a statistical certainty. The baseline threat level is determined entirely by where you source. Dense urban centers carry a heavily concentrated community viral load. This chart graphs the Johns Hopkins seroprevalence data. The infection rate for inner-city, non-Hispanic Black females aged 35 and older plateaus at 82.8%. Adjusting the target to providers aged 18 to 24 drops the prevalence to 41.3%. Geographic filtering offers another variable. Clients frequently bypass the inner city entirely, traveling toward the BWI suburbs or neighboring counties to source providers. This map illustrates the geographical divide in the data. Leaving the inner city and moving into these lighter blue zip codes, or out of Maryland entirely, drops the baseline prevalence exposure down to between 33 and 36%. This creates a direct trade-off. Driving to the suburbs requires more logistical effort and time, but it halves the likelihood of encountering an infected partner. Age and location filters are powerful reduction tools, but even at the lowest end of the mapped data, a prevalence rate of roughly 1 in 3 means regular participation in the hobby guarantees interaction with the virus. A subclinical infection occurs when the virus becomes active and contagious on the surface of the skin without generating any visible lesions or blisters. This calendar visualizes a standard infection timeline. If a provider experiences 4 typical outbreaks a year, each lasting about 7 days, the infection is visibly symptomatic for roughly 7.7% of the year. Skipping appointments during visible outbreaks successfully eliminates the most highly concentrated viral days. It also creates a profound sense of security for the client, but the virus is still shedding. Clinical data shows that herpes sheds asymptomatically on 25 to 37% of visually perfect days. The skin looks entirely healthy, but the virus is present and transmissible on the surface. Because asymptomatic shedding is the norm, an estimated 87.4% of infected individuals never recognize the symptoms and are completely unaware they carry the virus. A provider who actively gets cold sores, monitors for the tingling signs of an outbreak, and cancels appointments is statistically safer than a provider who assumes they are entirely clean and takes no precautions. We can calculate the exact timeline to infection for a hobbyist seeing an infected partner an average of 1.5 times a week. This graph charts the compounding probability over hundreds of visits. Without a condom, the per-act risk accumulates rapidly, resulting in a 50% chance of contracting genital herpes in just 5.2 years. Condoms act as a fluid barrier, but herpes is transmitted through friction. The virus sheds from anatomical areas the latex does not cover. Because of this skin-to-skin contact, perfect condom use only reduces female-to-male transmission by approximately 65%. Factoring in that reduction flattens the curve. With strict, consistent condom use, that 50% probability threshold is pushed out to 14.8 years. These calculations represent statistical averages. In high-prevalence environments, the dice are rolled every session, and transmission can technically occur on the very first visit. Condoms are a highly effective delay tactic. They triple the mathematical safety window, but are a physical mitigation, not an absolute shield against compound probability. The largest gap in risk mitigation involves a different strain of the virus entirely. Contracting genital herpes through unprotected oral sex from a provider with a history of oral cold sores is now a leading cause of new infections. Oral HSV-1 sheds asymptomatically on up to 37% of days, almost twice as often as genital HSV-2. This high shedding rate accelerates the math. With regular, unprotected oral sex, the cumulative probability of infection hits 50% in just 11 months. Clients routinely use condoms for intercourse, but barriers for oral sex are exceptionally rare, leaving the client entirely exposed to this specific vector. The primary defense against this timeline is biology. Up to 64% of the global population acquired oral HSV-1 during childhood, providing pre-existing immunity. If you lack those childhood antibodies, receiving oral sex from a partner with a history of cold sores carries a higher mathematical risk of genital infection than having protected vaginal intercourse with them. We can distill all of these variables, the geographic prevalence, the asymptomatic biology, and the barrier math, down to 3 specific behavioral archetypes. The short-term gambler sources within high-prevalence urban demographics, skips condoms, and accepts unprotected oral sex. This behavior mathematically guarantees contracting the virus within months. The demographic mitigator travels to the suburbs and screens for younger providers. They have their baseline exposure to the virus, but by relying only on visual checks, they remain highly vulnerable to asymptomatic shedding. The shielded optimizer uses condoms for every act, strictly filters for lower prevalence demographics, and relies on pre-existing HSV-1 immunity to mitigate the oral vector. This scorecard lays out the reality. Behavioral discipline dictates the math, extending the risk horizon from a rapid 11 months for the gambler to over 15 years for the optimizer. Operating in a high-prevalence urban environment requires clinical discipline. Strict risk mitigation can buy you a decade of safety, but it cannot override the math and achieve absolute zero.